I'll introduce the session. So yes, welcome and thank you for coming and spending your evening with us to discuss basic income and basic income pilots. Tonight we'll be learning from work that's been done in Finland and in Scotland. I'm joined by Olli Kangas and Vaughan. My name is Cleo Goodman. I am the co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. Previously, I was director of Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland, the sort of grassroots volunteer-led basic income charity up in Scotland. I know some of my colleagues are in the chat, so do say hello to them and keep an eye out for anything interesting that they've got to say, which is inevitable. The Scottish feasibility study and piloting generally has been a big part of basic income since I've learned about it, since I've been working on it. And it's kind of exactly why it feels like it's kind of within arm's reach. So that will be an interesting aspect of our discussion today, to think about whether piloting takes us closer and how close we are to a pilot here in the UK. This conversation is hosted by Basic Income Conversation. We're a new arm of Compass, the organisation Compass, dedicated to exploring the idea of basic income in the UK. My colleague Michael is on the chat, so he will be sharing exciting and interesting links throughout the conversation that are relevant to what we're talking about. He'll also be taking the questions from the chat and sending them over to me so I can pose them to Olli and Paul. So yeah, just a bit of housekeeping with that. I'm here to chair the conversation. I'll start with a bit of an introduction to the event. Olli and Paul will then do a short introduction to their work. And then the three of us will dig into that a little bit, and then we'll spend the rest of the time doing a Q&A. So do pass on the questions. You can private message Michael on Compass Office in the Zoom chat function. So if you want to just send questions straight over to him, he'll pick them out and send them to me. But we do have dozens of people on this call, so it's unlikely that we'll be able to get through all of those questions. But you do have free reign of the chat box. So if you want to talk amongst yourselves about things like that, then please do. It's good that there will be some dialogue out with those of us on the screen tonight. Yeah, and introduce yourself. Tell us where you're coming from this evening. It'll be interesting to see the spread of geographic spread of people who are joining us. We are recording the event as well, so we'll put that on our YouTube channel at the end of the evening, probably, if not over the next couple of days. We are looking for a discussion here. This isn't going to be a debate. We'll be talking around lots of the interesting aspects of piloting basic income and applying those to the situation in the UK. This is the second event in our summer series that focuses on the kind of more technical side of basic income rather than the philosophical or the political campaigning side of it. So we're here to share insights on the research on basic income. This is because we are very interested in that. One of our 3 strands of work is supporting a research network that will be launching later in the year. Any questions of that, you can drop us a message or an email. A fortnight ago, we had our first event in this series, Basic Income and the Future of Work. This is on our YouTube channel now. Mike's going to share a link to that. And in August, we have the third and final event, which is monetary financing and sovereign money, and basic income. Another interesting topic there. So for a bit of context, to make sure that everyone's roughly on the same page before we start with the slightly more technical aspects of piloting a basic income. To come back to basic income as a concept itself. It goes by other names. It goes by citizens' basic income, universal basic income. In essence, it's a cash payment that is paid regularly to everyone regardless of their circumstance. It has 5 characteristics. It's universal, it's unconditional, it's paid in cash, regularly, and to the individual. Some of these parts of the definition of a basic income make it overtly difficult to test in a pilot. For example, it being universal. Pilots are only paid to a small number of people with lots of conditions around it. That makes it hard to do an unconditional payment. And actually, some of the bits that should maybe be easier, the fact that it's an income, that it's paid to the individual, sometimes that poses specific challenges within an existing social security system that make piloting quite challenging. So piloting is the focus of much of the discussion around basic income. And sometimes this is dismissed by people with a let's just get on with it. We've done pilots, we've done them around the world, we've got lots of evidence around that, let's just implement our basic income. But the way that you design an experiment determines what you can measure and what you can learn. So there's a lot to learn from doing an experiment in situ in a specific context. For example, in Scotland, if we were going to implement a basic income, we'd want to know exactly how it works in Scotland, in the economy, with the people. And that is what a pilot is designed to do. And another part of why basic income pilots are so exciting is because it's a real opportunity to do evidence-based policy making, which should be an aspiration, surely. It's an exciting opportunity there. So as much as a basic income as a policy is a very exciting opportunity to do something revolutionary and transformative, pilots are also a big opportunity to do something very exciting. So wonderful speakers this evening are Olli Kangas. We're really pleased to welcome Olli, who's joining us from Finland. He's the Director of Equal Society Research at the Academy of Finland and Professor of Practice at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Turku. He was one of the leading designers of the Finnish experiment, which was a 2-year experiment. The final results of the full pilot were announced in June this year. He oversaw the pilot at Kela, which is the social insurance institution of Finland, as the scientific director of the experiment, which saw 2,000 unemployed Finns receive a basic income between 2016 and 2018. So he's going to share some of his findings, some of the findings from the experiment, and has lots of insight to offer us in terms of the debate about pilots, but also politics, apparently. So that should be interesting. We also have Paul Vaughan, who is Head of Communities and Neighbourhoods at Fife Council in Scotland. He is a member of the Scottish Citizens Basic Income Feasibility Study Steering Group. So this is a big fan of this piece of work myself. It's been something that I've been very excited to hear about for a really long time. We've been waiting to read this final report for a couple of years. And it is, an incredibly comprehensive investigation into piloting basic income. The study was carried out by 4 local authorities: Glasgow, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire and Fife, so including Fife, where Paul is joining us from. And that is actually also where the story began, kind of with piloting and with this investigation of basic income in Scotland. So the report found that pilots are desirable, but there are significant barriers to these pilots being implemented, and we'll hear more about this shortly. So that's enough from me just now. I'm going to hand over to Olli to give us a short introduction to himself and to his work, and then we'll hear from Paul.
Thank you, Cleo. The introduction of myself was very well done by you, so that I'll introduce the pilot that we had, the experiment. So Cleo had 5 conditions for basic income, and we had 4 of those 5 in our experiment. The only missing link was the universality, because we had 2,000 unemployed persons included in the study. And in the very beginning, when we began to plan our study and experiment, we had much more higher ideas what we can do, so that we had an idea that it should be obligatory, it should be nationwide, it should be randomized, there should be a treatment group and a control group. And in addition to that, the nationwide experiment, we thought that there should be a local experiment to get the kind of local effects and interaction effects, how people behave when everybody is getting basic income in small municipalities. But the problem was that we got only 20 million euros for the experiment, and then we had to come from the stars to the ashes, in that sense that we only had that nationwide experiment, and we had to give up planning those local experiments. But what I think what is unique in this experiment that we ran was that it was obligatory to avoid selection bias, and also that it's randomized nationwide, and we had that treatment group and control group that in the beginning of the experiment, they were totally identical, so that we can draw very strong causal consequences and causal explanations if in the end of the experiment there were differences. And when we were planning, we had lots of political discussions, and we had also lots of constitutional questions, because it was obligatory. And then the Constitutional Committee of the Parliament, they discussed very much that is it possible and is it allowed to compel people to participate in this kind of experiment, human experiment, where somebody is getting something and some other people in the control group, they are getting nothing. But finally they said yes, and we could start our experiment. And the results were rather strong in that sense that in this specific group that we experimented with, the employment effects were not that strong. They were not statistically significant. They were statistically significant among those in the treatment group that had families and children, and also among immigrants. But among the other people, it was not totally significant what we got out. But anyway, those who were getting basic income, they had a little bit better employment record than those in the control group. And we also asked and applied surveys and asked people about the general well-being and that kind of questions. And it appeared to be so that the respondents in the treatment group, they felt that they have better mental health, they have better picture of themselves, they had more self-reliance and they were more self-confident, and they trusted much more their ability to control their own lives and control also the economies and family economy. And that was, to my mind, rather significant result from those surveys, that the general well-being among those respondents who were in the treatment group felt much better than those in the control group. And then you said that the final results came out there, but I would say that they are not at all final results, because we are just now working with registers and unifying registers with surveys and analyzing those face-to-face interviews that we did. So that I would say that it was just the end of the beginning, and now it's something that will start really, and the run begins just now.
Fabulous, thank you, and I'm glad to hear that, and there's more to come. Paul, if you want to hand over to you, you can introduce yourself and the Scottish feasibility study.
Yeah, thanks, Cleo. I mean, I think from going from Olli, where they've run their pilot and have results, we're at this position where we've just done the feasibility work and looking at how we would actually pilot a basic income in Scotland. So this has been a 2-year feasibility study that we've undertaken across the 4 local authorities that you mentioned, alongside NHS Health Scotland, who provided a lot of very useful support around the evaluation and around the evaluability assessment work. Very much we've developed a preferred model that we would be proposing to test, that includes, based on the 5 principles that you mentioned about the universal, the unconditional, the individual, the periodic, and the cash payment. Like Olli mentioned, that the proposal that we have is also to undertake this as a randomized control study. Probably slightly different from Olli's, that we are looking to actually try and test those community effects. So what we're looking at are 2 different levels of basic income. One that's based on the minimum income standard that's devised by the Joseph Ramtree Foundation, and another one that's very much based on, or much more closely based to current benefit levels within the UK. We would look to pilot both of these, one and in 2 different areas, and on a third one we would also have a sort of control group to judge all of that against. So we very much are sort of in that against. So we very much are sort of in that controlled model as well in terms of what we're actually doing. We're looking as well, I think one of the things that we undertook was very much to get involved in, was very much to get involved in the looking at the way that we could interact with the current benefits system within the UK. And that's been actually quite a challenge because the benefit system is very, very complicated. Excuse me a second.
From home. We'll cut back to Paul in a minute, but I'll ask Olli some questions while we've got a wee second. So it was an obligatory participation, which is that's what you see as the sort of unique part of the Finnish trial. Have any of the other pilots that have been done around the world been performed like that?
So as far as I know, the Finnish experiment is unique in that sense that it's obligatory. Other experiments in 70s, 80s in the US, Canada, they were voluntary, and also other experiments. And Paul, is it so that your experiment is voluntary also, or are they obligatory participation involved in?
I think, and we can ask Paul about this when he comes back. But
I'm back.
Oh, good. Sorry,
sorry. Yeah. So, well, I mean, to answer that, yes. I mean, we had very much looked at a lot of the ethics of this as well, because it became quite clear that that was quite a difficult subject for us to address, and very much that it would be folk opting in to actually be part of the pilot rather than just assuming that it was everyone, but very much concentrated on areas that we would actually have so we could test some of those community benefits. Some of the things that we'd be looking at in terms of the outcomes that we're actually after are outcomes around poverty and how it impacts on poverty, outcomes on unemployment as well, how that impacts, how that's impacted. And I think very much drawing from a lot of the learning that's happened in other areas around pilots, beginning to ask about what are the health and well-being effects, what are some of the experiential effects that folk have. I mentioned one of the things very much for us was we're seeing this pilot as taking place within the context of the welfare system that exists within Scotland and the rest of the UK. And that adds a very heavy degree of complexity, I think, to the way that we're actually trying to work on this. A number of benefits that we would look to actually suspend for those people that were actually taking part within the pilot, but equally recognizing that we are trying to address need within communities, and so a number of benefits that we would actually continue around disability, around work capability, around housing, around childcare, which we don't think we could ever actually properly deal with within a basic income, and sometimes that's referred to as basic income plus in terms of the way that we're actually looking at it. I think briefly from the work that we have done, there are some quite big challenges that we've encountered as we've developed this and as we think we would actually pilot it. The feasibility study looks at feasibility from 4 particular angles, looks at the psychological feasibility of undertaking a pilot, looks at the behavioural feasibility, the institutional feasibility, and the financial and economic one. And I think probably from the steering group's perspective, it's the institutional and from most other folk, the financial and the economic one that really is some of the biggest things that we will have to address if we go forward with the pilot in Scotland. The institutional one is really around the fact that we have a split of benefit system. Within the UK, there are certain benefits that the Scottish Government control and run, and some taxes that they control or have ability to adjust. but most of the welfare system is reserved matter to the government in Westminster for the whole of the UK. And therefore we actually are going to need UK, Scottish, local government to all work together to actually undertake any particular pilot. I think a lot of focus is often made on the financial costs and the economic impact of that. We were quite conscious of that as we started to work through the feasibility work, and commissioned the Fraser of Allender Institute at the University of Strathclyde alongside Manchester Metropolitan University and IPPR Scotland to do some fairly innovative macroeconomic or economic modelling of what would actually happen if a pilot was then rolled out across the whole of Scotland. And if you go to basicincome.scot, you'll see the links to the reports that go into this in some detail. But I mean, I think that particular part of the feasibility study looked at a micro simulation to see what would happen to individuals and to families, looked then at a dynamic macro simulation to see what would happen to the Scottish economy as a whole over a period of time, and then took those results and put them back into the micro model just to see what that then meant and the final stages for individuals. And I think some of that is quite tough reading for those of us who've been involved. I think likewise, if you have a look at the report that was done by the Child Poverty Action Group on behalf of the steering group in terms of the interaction with the benefit system, you get a very clear view on the complexities that there are within the system, and how putting a basic income, even as a pilot at the moment, into that system will cause, it's quite a complicated activity to undertake. I suppose the final thing to say is all 4 councils that were involved in this have all approved this report, have all said that they would want to see this take part in Scotland, and that's covering the 3 largest authorities in Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and ourselves in Fife, and alongside our colleagues in North Ayrshire who are also very keen on how we actually deliver this across Scotland. The report is now with the Scottish Government. Certainly the Cabinet Secretary here has written to her counterpart in Westminster, drawing their attention to the feasibility study and seeking further support for actually undertaking the pilot. So that's the stage that we're at now in Scotland.
Fabulous, thank you both. Yeah, so loads and loads to discuss here. Well, Olli, initially I'm interested to hear, so Paul's kind of outlined the complexity of a Scottish pilot that acknowledges the existing social security system and also the sort of varied and many institutions that need to be cooperating with the piloting and, essentially with the intentions of the experiment as well, and in what it wants to measure. How was that experience in Finland? Did you face similar challenges?
Yeah, actually, I share lots of ideas and those feelings what Paul had, so that we also started with microsimulations, and we wrote the first report that was something like 300-400 pages, only microsimulations. I suppose that nobody has read it except 5 of us who wrote that report. And on the basis of that, we then began to plan the legislation. As I said, that because the experiment was obligatory, we had to write the legislation for the experiment to avoid arbitrariness. And also the Finnish social security system is rather complex, and we had to anticipate what would happen if a person who is getting a basic income is unemployed, gets employment, gets children or child, and gets unemployed again, gets sick, etc., etc. We had to try to anticipate all those changes in the social status of the recipient of the basic income. And it was a rather complex task to write the legislation. And therefore, when we discussed it with lawyers, they said that it's better to concentrate one single specific group that we know something about. And therefore, it became that we concentrated only on the unemployed. And in that sense, I think that the Scottish experiment will be much better than our experiment. And also in that sense that in Scotland, you will have those community effects that we couldn't get. And also the legislation was rather tricky question in that sense that our government wanted to know how the European level legislation would react on that kind of device or thing as basic income in one single member state. And the big question was that if basic income is that kind of benefit that it can be taken away from Finland, and is it transportable or portable or not? That was the big question. And we had to write lots about that and to show to our politicians that, which kind of thing basic income is in that sense. And still the big question is that if basic income is possible to implement in one single European country, and how the European level legislation would say, what the European level legislation would say about it. So that as the situation is just now in the UK, you don't need to take into consideration the euro and Brussels, but perhaps in Scotland you have to take consideration the southern part of the country, what they are saying. So that there are complexities, even it's easy to say, as our government wrote 2015, its governmental program, that we will have a basic income experiment. Okay, it's very easy to say, but it's very hard task to plan it and to do it. And I'm pretty happy. I'm not totally happy with the experiment. Lots of problems in the experiment, but I'm happy that we could run it through, so that the window, constitutional window, legislative window is not now open for better experiment for somebody else to try. And actually the present government that we have just now, they intake governmental program that they launched a year ago. They said that they will have a new experiment, but because of this pandemic, I have not heard anything about that experiment. But let's see.
Interesting. So these community effects that you mentioned that weren't tested by the Finnish experiment because that went to a specific group of people by a characteristic, so it was unemployed people. That is the focus, or one of the key focuses of the Scottish pilots that have been proposed. Paul, do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at, I suppose, the way that we would actually, in terms of design, the areas that we would actually want to use, and therefore look at them, what the scale and what the size of those groups would need to be. And I think in terms of those community effects, I think it's been very difficult across a number of areas in terms of either pilots that have been run, or how general or how generalized the findings can be from some other areas. But it's looking at, well, how does how does a community come together? What sort of additional support needs are actually being met through the fact that you have this unconditional basic income that's coming to a group? What can you actually see in terms of the way that I suppose the social fabric of an area changes over that particular period of time? A lot is made of how this could actually support entrepreneurism, how it could actually support the use of community organizations, how folk might actually volunteer more because they have other time that they can actually do. They can adjust the time that they're actually spending between work, between family, between community organizations, and how that would actually work. So these are some of the effects that I think have been actually really quite difficult to find elsewhere, and to see what the impact would be, because there are not really any pure basic income pilots. There are some models that we have investigated and are listed in the sort of appendices of the report that look at some of these effects, but some of them are quite dated in terms of some of the results that you actually have, and not all of these types of broad outcomes have actually been explored in any depth in some of these areas. So a lot is made of those unemployment effects and maybe some of the income and poverty effects. But if we're looking at some of the social effects, the way that we're going to have to do that is within that community, almost get into that community, see what it's like at this particular point in time. And if we're talking about a 3-year pilot, which again is slightly longer than some other places have been looking at. And it would be seeing, well, what change can you actually find over 3 years within the pilot? And how generalized can that can those findings be to what might then happen at a larger geography? Similarly, in some of the economic impacts that you would want to look at, how much of that's actually going to be demonstrable over a short 3-year period, as opposed to saying, well, actually, we need to take a much longer period before that happens.
Yeah, very interesting. The sort of staged, what can you actually conclude from the short term, and what do you need to dig into more deeply, or with a longer pilot, potentially even a pilot of the full policy to really understand. So I mean, and I think the reception of results from trials or from pilots is a really interesting part of the process, because of course the commitment is only made to the short-term piloting of the policy, and there are a lot of conclusions made in the press, perhaps, rather than but the scientists and the people delivering the experiments are always very keen to make it clear that actually the conclusions being drawn from the pilots themselves are very encroached in lots of caveats. Olli, I imagine this is something quite close to your your experience of the public perception of the Finnish pilots. There was a lot of reports of them having been cancelled, having failed. How was that to sort of contend with as someone delivering the pilots?
Somebody said sometimes that there are lots of fake news. And there were lots of fake news as regards the Finnish experiment. And when we launched those preliminary results a year ago, it was very interesting to sit in front of all those representatives of mass media. And when we were giving those presentations, I was imagining in my mind that which kind of rubrics and titles there will be in newspapers and how they will report, and I was rather correct in my imagination. So that first, the failure, the Finnish basic income experiment is a great failure. No employment effects, as if employment effect would be the most important thing with basic income. If you ask those big names who are the biggest proponents of basic income, they are saying that the employment is not the main issue in basic income. There are other aspects that are more interesting. And then there are lots of writings that because basic income doesn't increase employment, in that case, basic income is a failure. But there was not that much writing about that the level of employment was about the same in both groups. So that the proponents of the basic income gradually came in the picture, and they began to write that, okay, there you see, basic income is not making people more lazy, or easier than the present social security that is conditional and that punishes people if they don't find employment, if they are unemployed. And interestingly enough, the first kind of writing was more or less missing when we launched our second results, showing that the employment among the treatment group is a little bit higher than among the control group, and in some groups the difference is significant in favor of the treatment group, so that it was obvious reasons silence from the opponent side that are opposing basic income. So that it's very interesting to see how mass media wrote about the experiment, and one aspect that we are studying and analyzing is also the mass media analysis, that how mass media framed the experiment and how mass media framed the results. So that in addition to those results in terms of employment and in terms of well-being, in terms of health, in terms of self-respect, we are interested in the treatment of the experiment in mass media and how it was framed and politically interpreted here and there.
Potentially a helpful bit of work to come ahead of any further work in Scotland there then, Paul. Have you and the feasibility study group, have you thought about the impact of the perception of both the feasibility study and the pilots?
I think we've experienced all responses, either from mass media or from from others who want to comment on it. I mean, we have gone from, I mean, it's probably a surprise to some folk that there isn't actually a pilot happening in Scotland, because there was, for a long time, I think folk just thought that it was happening up here. I think some folk would be quite disappointed to find out that we were just actually doing the feasibility study. I think interestingly, when the feasibility study came out, there was very little negative coverage that came with that. A lot of very positive reaction to the idea of basic income and the idea of actually piloting it. I think, interestingly, of course, we launched the report just at the start of June there, so we were in the middle of the current the current health crisis. So a lot of folk, I think, there'd been an awful lot of discussion of this, and I think certainly the politicians at the councils that were involved were feeling a little bit, were wanting to comment on these things because they knew what was in the pilot study and or in the feasibility study and knew what some of the things were that we were saying. I think the other, I suppose, reaction that we've probably had is until there is some really hard and fast evidence of it within a UK context, within the Scottish context, there is still an awful lot of hypothetical argument for and against. And I think that's one of the big messages in the feasibility study is we have to get past that. If you're actually serious about wanting to test it, then here's how you would test, as far as we can see, as close as possible to your sort of pure basic income model, or at least basic income plus in the way that we've designed it. And that any sort of discussion that was happening that was trying to argue a counter position to where we were or things was still relying on I think a lot of the hypothetical arguments, which I think if you go through the feasibility study, you will see most of them addressed, either on the grounds of a fairly extensive, if not one of the most extensive literature searches that had ever been done on basic income, which really sort of, I think as Olli's pointing out, doesn't really find the negative effects that folk argue will actually happen. But again, because a lot of this is sometimes small or sometimes has been done in countries that don't have the same sort of developed welfare system or complicated welfare system, it's difficult to sometimes draw on, how generalized those would be. But, I mean, generally, we took a conscious decision very early on in the feasibility work to engage as much as we could, to have stakeholder groups, which some of you have been along to, and to get those views, and as much as possible to get either the contrary or the contrary views, or at least the critiques that we were actually after in terms of developing the feasibility proposal.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'll move on to taking some questions that we're getting in the chat here. So I have a question from Sylvia, which I think does relate a little bit to that in terms of generalizability, but the opposite of that. Like, what are the specific things that a local pilot can highlight? So if we do roll out a basic income, we're making sure that we understand exactly how it's impacted them, but also if we're going to do a pilot, how do we make sure that the impacts on participants are positive? So Sylvia's question was, I suppose, directed at Olli, and asking whether the impact on the pilot ending had an impact on participants, and whether that's been examined just yet.
Of course, the problem with all experiments and pilots is that the people who are included in the experiment, they know that this fun will not last forever. So that in Canada, they had that kind of experiment that started, and people were thinking that it would be the future social security system, but it ended. And also in our experiment, people knew that after 2 years it will be over. And of course, it has an impact. People don't do big changes, but we were mostly interested in small changes, how the employment behavior would change or not. And if this basic income would somehow boost people's self-reliance and general well-being. And the answer to some extent to both questions is yes and a question mark. So that there are limitations, and also in Paul's case, 3 years is rather a short time. In Kenya, they have one experiment that is running 12 years, so that it's a rather long period. But all those experiments, they are suffering from the same disease.
Paul, do you have anything to add in terms of how you would plan to look at the end of the experiment or negate negative impacts?
Yeah, I mean, we focused a fair bit within the feasibility study, I suppose, on two aspects of that. One was the ethical considerations, which I think Olli's sort of discussed, and then the other part of this was a section looking at transitional arrangements. What would we actually have to have in place? And I think the transitional arrangements are interesting because we were actually focused on what the entire sort of life cycle of the pilot would look like. So how do you actually transition on to that? So what are some of the criteria? What are some of the support mechanisms that you would actually want to put in place as folks started to say, yes, I want to be part of this pilot? What would we actually want to have in place during the pilot? What else do we actually want to make sure is available to individuals, making sure that they understand the length of time that they're going to be on that pilot? And then as the pilot finishes, how do you transition out and transition off? And I think, you know, it was interesting sort of having those discussions. I think as well that some of the discussions that we had with sort of certain rights and advice organizations were probably quite helpful looking at those, because that pointed us in directions around the types of support mechanism that you would actually have available, but also I think making sure that you weren't actually creating a special amount of work or a special support mechanism just for those individuals. I think one of the interesting things from the Canada experiment that then was sort of abruptly halted was that individuals who were part of that experiment have formed their own groups and have almost created a small community themselves to actually support folk. So, you know, that's quite interesting. I think it's that thing, how big a change will folk make? 3 years is not a long time, But I think we know from some of the evidence that Olli and his colleagues have collated, and some of the stuff that we've seen elsewhere, that individuals will start to make plans, things that they think they can do within that period of time. And the more difficult part is as we actually try and transition off, and how do we actually see the support that's needed there, and what folk will actually start to do. Same with that, within that last 12 months, within the last 6 months of any particular pilot, do you start to see changes in behaviour at that particular point that are pointing to the fact that folk are building in the fact that a pilot is ending into their behaviour? And those are, I think, some of the things that we'd be wanting to look at as we started to roll out any pilots.
Yeah, very interesting. So I suppose we've talked about the individual effects and but also how pilots would like to look at community level effects. So how communities are affected by all receiving a basic income, all changing their behaviour, and whether the individual effects sort of multiply or interact with each other to produce additional outcomes. And I suppose there's also another aspect of pilots that don't test how the basic income is funded. So, for example, if you're funding it through additional taxes and through reconfiguring your tax system and your whole economy, a pilot doesn't test that either. So we had a question from Alan, which was about the Scottish proposal, which is to test a basic income but not the extra taxes that would be needed. So does that limit the usefulness of the findings, and does that matter? I know that the basic income is proposed to be taxable, so that does test something, but I'll let Paul speak.
Yeah, we were looking at, I mean, within that broader context, that was partially why we actually did the economic simulations, was very much to try and get a handle on if at a stage where it was decided to roll it out across the whole of Scotland, then what might the impacts actually be. I think even within the pilot, though, some of the things that we have certainly proposed is that individuals that are on the pilot would potentially find some changes getting made to the way that they were receiving their benefits. So we have a very clear, ethical ground around no detriment to individuals that are taking part. Hence why some of the welfare benefits we would actually be saying that we think they stay in place, but others we would be actually looking at how they actually switched off and how that affected individuals' behaviour within that model. As they switched off, to a certain extent, some of the funding that was probably going out through those particular mechanisms, one would hope could be redirected to the actual cost and offsetting the cost of the gross cost of any particular pilot. The wider effects that we looked at through the economic modelling did look at what would have to happen, only to one particular tax rate, only to looking at income tax, to see how you would actually create a balanced budget. So sort of putting that constraint into the system to see what actually happens. And as you might expect, the interest rate, the tax rates all rise, different options looked at, but what we were never saying was that was the only way to actually fund this. If we were looking at a much broader rollout, we think there's a lot more work that's needing done to actually explore how you finance this type of model, because some of the things that you can't easily take into account are if there are health and well-being effects, how does that actually maybe reduce the amount of income that's actually getting spent, or how much tax is getting spent on health services and things like that.
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, another really good question here from Corentin. So the question is, from what I understand, there were no statistically significant effect regarding the return to employment, but what about the different types of employment, the different types of work? So volunteering, civic duty, NGOs. Olli, can you speak on that?
Yep, just now we are in the phase where we are analyzing the data at the aggregate level, so that in the next step we will unify all kind of registers that are available in Finland. And the Finnish situation to do that kind of register studies is very good, because we can unify, for example, on the basis of personal identification number, income registers, employment registers, everything, health registers, which kind of medicine people are eating, which kind of diagnosis they are suffering from, etc. So that just now, we, as I said, that it's end or the beginning, and now the real analysis will start when we combine all registers and see better what has happened in different groups. But the problem with the Finnish experiment is that we had only 2,000 people included in the experiment, so that it's very difficult to see any statistical power if we go to smaller groups, for example, single parents, etc. So that there are a couple of hundreds of them in the experiment, but then the results that will get out, they are not statistically significant. So that anyway, we are gonna do those separate analysis for separate categories of people.
Great, yeah, really interesting. I'm excited to see the treasure trove of further analysis that comes out over the next few months.
And also one additional thing is that good with the registers is that we can follow the same individuals 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and see if the impacts are somehow temporary, how soon they fade away, or if they are permanent or not. So, and also it's possible to see which kind of family level impacts there will be, because it's possible to unify also family level information. And perhaps it may be so that the long term, or may not be, we don't know, long-term effects on children who are getting the basic income. So that there are lots of possibilities, and only the sky is limit what to do. And my hope is that we can open the data for everybody who is interested in doing analysis, not only the Finnish scientists, but also scientists everywhere.
Yeah, great.
But there may be some legal barriers once again, so that the lawyers are a little bit tricky.
Yeah. So yeah, really fantastic question from Sophie about sort of the opportunity window for a basic income, both right now, so relating to the current crisis and the current interest in basic income as a response to that, and also in relation to a pilot. So if you have a basic income pilot, is the opportunity window for implementing the full policy after the pilot closing quite quickly? So yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think that the process, you know, is it, how do you go from pilot to policy, I suppose, or do you have any thoughts around how that might happen? Paul, I'll go to you with that, if that's right.
I think we've considered this on a number of occasions. I don't think we ever reached a particular conclusion. I think throughout the sort of study period, that when we've been working and looking at the feasibility, that there have been the views that, you know, you're undertaking a pilot to test certain aspects of it, to try and work out where some of the fault lines lie, and some of the changes that you would actually want to make before you actually progressed to actually implementation at a full level. And I would say that certainly at the start of this process, that was very much where I think Fife and North Ayrshire councils very much were. That the whole point of undertaking the pilot was to actually is very much to influence national policy or Scottish-wide policy, and to say that there is to explore whether there is a different way of actually delivering this type of support. I think as we went through those discussions, And certainly with the stakeholder groups, there's a lot of different views about why you're undertaking that. I think ultimately from the view of the steering group and from the view of the councils that have agreed to that, they're very much wanting to see this run, because they believe, or the councils believe, that there are changes that this could result in that they think will be beneficial to the people in Scotland. So I think there's quite a challenge there. Not all policy changes are piloted. And there's I think there's quite a debate that can be had about whether through the pilot you can actually, there's always going to be those constraints. There's always going to be the contextual issues that you can't always address. And I think we are very accepting of that, and we understand that those are some of the issues. But I think if we're quite clear about the outcomes that we're actually trying to test, we're quite clear about the scale of the change that we expect to be able to see, then we've got something that we can sort of baseline against to say, well, this is what we actually we think would happen. Equally with the control group that Olli had, that we are proposing as well, we'll be able to sort of test that and say, well, what differences are we actually seeing over that period of time.
Great, yeah. So Olli, do you have any thoughts on that? Where's the window in Finland then?
I think that we are in the start again in the political debates, and it's good to remember that none of those pilots or experiments that we have is a silver bullet that will solve the situation in that way that, okay, let's have a pilot, let's have an experiment, and then we will decide either to have basic income or not to have. There are always problems in experiments, and to my mind, it's good to have those experiments. And for example, to compare the Finnish results with the Scottish results, and to compare them with those results what they have gotten in the Netherlands and in some other countries, in Canada, etc. So the basic income, despite the fact that it's a pretty simple idea, there are many angles, and every single experiment is looking at the phenomenon from its own angle. But for example, in Canada, child poverty was a very big issue, whereas in Finland it was not at all discussed. So that in each country, those pilots, they try to answer to national and local questions, and those local questions are related to national institutions. For example, which kind of problems we have in our social security systems here, and so that in that sense it's very good to have those experiments, but it's good to have it in mind that they are not silver bullets that will solve all the problems at once. So that we have experiments, and we need experiments, and it's good to have them, but then I think that in each country, in the case that the basic income will be implemented, perhaps it will be implemented by some kind of baby steps, little bit this direction and a little bit that direction, and then we will perhaps have it. And when it comes to the Finnish situation, I think that for political reasons and practical reasons, we will not see any decisions that the basic income will be implemented in this country. But I think that there will be lots of decisions that we will simplify our social security system by putting together different kind of basic security benefits that we have. And in that way, the system will be simpler and more comprehensive to understand for people. And also it's a small step towards, perhaps, towards what we call basic income. But for political reasons, at least just now in Finland, it's not good to speak about it. Okay, let's implement basic income, but it's much better to say that let's simplify our basic social security system.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I suppose, that the outputs of pilots aren't necessarily we implement a basic income, we use the learning to shift the social security system. I've seen some interesting debate in the chat about pilots versus just planning and moving towards a basic income. I suppose, Paul, you mentioned a minute ago that not all policies are piloted, and actually it doesn't feel to me that that is actually common practice. Normally policies are put in place. Pilots are quite an unusual approach, but very, very much the approach taken with basic income as far as I can tell. So we have Francine suggesting that we should just plan our best basic income based on the knowledge that we have, and then implement the policy. And then Alan suggesting that we decide a date to implement our basic income, and then we do pilots in the meantime to work out how to do that with the least risk. So I suppose the question is why pilot? Paul, do you want to go for that? It's been what you've been thinking about for a while.
Well, I mean, why pilot? I mean, our view is that you're piloting in a different context from the evidence that's available at the moment. You're piloting to test certain aspects of the outcomes that you think that you're going to gain from shifting the system and trying something slightly different. You're piloting, I think, on our view, because the evidence across the world that does exist is not always transferable to one particular context, and sometimes is not. You will find some conflicting evidence when you actually go through the studies that have been done. So you're really sort of saying, well, we need to actually see what this means within the Scottish context, within the Finnish context, and how folk will actually react to that. So I mean, I think there are good reasons. There are good reasons for piloting, and certainly early conversations that we had. And I noticed somebody in the chat mentioning Guy Standing. I mean, Guy was up numerous times in Fife, speaking to us about the options and how you would actually pilot. Similarly, Annie Miller I've seen being mentioned as well, and Annie's probably become quite a well-known face to all the members of the steering group in terms of her views and providing evidence and ideas around why the piloting of the approach would be the best idea. I think in particular from the steering group's perspective, the fact that we had quite a wide range of views coming together from the 4 different councils, alongside the NHS Health Scotland view and the Scottish Government view about what was happening, probably just directed us more in terms of looking at the poverty, the health and well-being outcomes, and how we thought that those could be addressed, and how a basic income would support those particular or could support those tackling those particular issues. So I think that's probably where we got to in terms of sort of saying, yes, there is definitely the need for the pilot, just because of this mix of evidence that actually exists at the moment, and how does that then actually pertain to the Scottish context.
So yeah, someone asking, oh sorry, Olli, you carry on.
Yeah, actually the last government in Finland that was centered the right government, they introduced something that they called experimental culture, and somehow they wanted to start with the flagship that the basic income experiment was, but there are lots of smaller experiments. For example, kind of participation income, something like that, what Anthony Atkinson spoke about, so that it's done at the municipal level, and it's minor in comparison to the basic income. And the government had an idea that it's better to experiment with the different kind of ideas and to experiment with a smaller number of people instead of exposing the total population with bad solutions. So that they very much spoke in favor of evidence-based policy making, and they somehow encouraged all kind of experiments, employment experiments, municipal experiments, basic income experiment, the participation income experiment, and there are lots of experiments, and they are very much relying on that we will get something or stronger conclusions to base our political and policy-making decisions than just to make some kind of ad hoc or theoretical reasonings how things are working. So that I think that it's a good idea to have all kind of experiments, but of course sometimes we must jump into the darkness without any experiments, because very many things are that kind of things that we can't experiment with.
Interesting. I like bold steps is a good shout. Well, yeah. So Jenny's comment in the chat is not necessarily why pilots, but why more pilots. So I guess what are the biggest gaps that we see in the existing data that we want to fill with additional pilots? Paul, I mean, you've spoken a bit about the outcomes you want to test with the Scottish pilots, but what are the sort of key areas that we don't really know about at the moment?
I mean, I think apart from those areas that are, you know, the Kenyan examples, and there are examples in India and some other places where they're taking sort of larger groups of either communities, villages and things to actually undertake this. I think certainly the community-based impacts are something that are needing to be explored more. A lot of the sort of pilots, as opposed to countries or areas of countries that have something that looks like a basic income or is very similar in some aspects to it, have generally focused on a particular group and looked at what happens in that particular group, whether it was unemployed individuals or you know, some other particular group of individuals that they were wanting to actually see what impact it had. I think as well, what's the sort of overall impact of what you're actually going to see, not just in terms of the income, but I think on how individuals actually react and how behavior changes is something that we certainly struggled in terms of the modeling to do and to get a handle on. We considered some options and aspects of that, but I think generally felt that there was insufficient data and insufficient simulation data to actually allow us to do that. And I suppose in those ways I'm thinking about, well, how do folk change the way that they change the way that they're consuming time, if you like, you know, how much time they're spending family, organizationally, how much they're spending in communities. What does that mean in terms of the way that individuals are actually able to lead their lives? And you know, how would that work? Because that seems to be something that might be very specific to an individual, rather than what you see at the moment in terms of maybe impacts on a family level. How are we actually looking at those particular issues? And not always is that sort of, I think, picked up, but I think certainly the evidence that is out there so far tackles a number of the sort of outcomes that you expect to see within that sort of basic income model. And then there are areas certainly around, I think, some of the health and well-being, some of the poverty issues, and some of the community impacts that are probably slightly less well studied.
Yeah, I think that one aspect, we spoke about the microsimulations at the beginning, is that both in Scotland and Finland, we have done lots of microsimulations. And I think that we will get better data on behavioral effects, how people behave vis-a-vis basic income, if they are getting lazier, if they are making this or that. And it improves our possibilities to do microsimulations, so that instead of doing that kind of static microsimulations, we can impute then behavioral effects and have them more dynamic and then we will have more reliable microsimulation, dynamic microsimulation models. And I think that from the scientific perspective, this is very important. And by unifying effects from here and from there, we will be much cleverer and in a better position to run reliable microsimulations.
If maybe just expand it, I think I totally agree with Olli. I think one of the issues that we definitely found through the feasibility work was that when you got to the point of trying to simulate what it might mean across the whole of Scotland for this, there was a real lack of comparable evidence that could be used for building into a macroeconomic model. You could work on certain labour market assumptions, but they were only assumptions because there isn't really the evidence to sort of indicate what would actually happen within the labour market, how much time folk would, that change in balance of time that folk would have. And secondly, I think when it came to, and this is, partially, I suppose, a slight limitation within an economic model, or at least when you're looking at a macroeconomic model, is that how do you actually work out what the consumption is? How do folk change their consumption, their behaviour, what they actually purchase, what they're not purchasing, and what impact does that actually have? And again, a lack of real evidence from that end of the spectrum, and therefore a lot of assumptions getting made on what would happen. And broadly then, falling into, sort of the sort of split between a sort of neoclassical model through to that sort of Keynesian approach, and not really knowing, well, what's actually really the truth, because you haven't got the experiential data to actually build into the system and say, right, based on the work that's been done so far, based on multiple pilots, this is what we actually see happening, this is what therefore we think would be happening. And that probably says a little bit about, says something about the way that some pilots in some other countries and have actually been run, where maybe they've been looking very much at the social aspects and haven't been looking so much at what might happen if you then rolled it out, and what some of the larger consequences would be, and just not being able to get some of that data. So I think, as Olli's obviously demonstrated, actually getting the design correct right at the start of all of this is so important to actually getting that sort of level of information and the sort of real evidence that will allow others to look at this as a policy and see, well, is this something that you would actually want to go ahead with?
Fabulous, thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to ask one more question to Paul, which is from Harold, which hopefully is a relatively quick one. But so what is it exactly from government that you need to be able to run your basic income plan?
Right. Well, I mean, what we understand is that for a pilot of basic income to be run in Scotland, or actually anywhere in the UK, would actually require primary legislation. So we would actually have to have an Act of Parliament to allow us to have the pilot actually running. That would, but partly that's to do with the fact that so many of the social security powers are reserved at Westminster. But equally, that would also require, I think, changes in the Scottish legislation as well to allow some of these things to happen. So that's a piece of work that we only briefly explored, and we had a number of bits of dialogue with government colleagues in the DWP and in the Department of Work and Pensions, and also in the Revenues and Customs, and in terms of the tax impacts and things as well. So that, I think, is an outstanding issue. If there is a view in the UK and in Scotland that we actually go ahead with a pilot, that's one piece of work that is actually required. I think then it will probably come down to the way that we actually interact and actually work together to make this happen. It can't just be a local government issue. It can't just be a Scottish government. It can't just be a UK government in the current with the requirement for that legislation. And I think that's probably what we're really needing now is the will to actually move forward with this, and then actually finding the time and the getting the legislation actually devised. That's what we've been discussing. That's what we've been told.
Yes, thank you so much to Olli and Paul, and to everyone who's been asking questions and having a very interesting debate in the chat. I hope you've enjoyed the event. Of course, these kind of events where we're focusing on the more technical stuff is just one part of what we do with Basic Income Conversation. We do want the conversation to be happening in your living rooms and amongst friends and at work with people that have never heard of basic income. So if you want any guidance on how to do that, do sign up to our mailing list. If you're in Scotland and you want to volunteer for a basic income charity, you can get in touch with Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of, well, so this is the second of our summer series on basic income. The next event is on Monday, the 10th of August at 6:30 p.m. and it's on how we might pay for a basic income, assessing monetary financing and sovereign money. We'll be joined by prominent economists and writers Francis Koller and Jeff Crocker and Professor Emma Dorney. So you can sign up for that in the link in the chat. We'll circulate the link to the recording of this video in an email after the event. But once again, thank you so much for attending. Thanks to Olli and Paul, and enjoy the rest of your evening.